of the most popular destinations in Spain plans to ban apartment rentals to tourists in an effort to reduce housing costs for residents. Now, authorities say short-term rentals in Barcelona have resulted in rent increasing by a staggering 68% in the past 10 years. Spain has been ranked among the top 3 most visited countries in the world, between France and the US. Let's unpack the story further. We're joined this afternoon by Nick Budlender. He's in Cape Town. He is an urban policy researcher at Ndifuna Ukwazi. And Santi Mas De Xaxas is a housing activist. He joins us from Barcelona. To both of our guests, a warm welcome. Thanks very much indeed for coming onto the program. Santi, I want to begin with you this afternoon. And this is certainly a story that we can relate to in particular parts of South Africa as well. A drastic step, but one that I imagine is welcomed by activists like you.
No, yeah, totally. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us. And yes, the ban for tourist apartments in Barcelona is going to be a relevant matter. The thing is that they just announced it now. That we need to wait until 2028. Then in between we have some elections. And again, every time that this measure has been taken only because of the pressure which there has been on the streets. Tomorrow there is a mass demonstration against the effect of tourism. It's not against tourism in itself, but against the effect that tourism is generating in our cities. And we are not that sure that this ban will really take place, but at least it's a step in the right direction, and only if we keep pressuring that will really happen. So
yeah,
there's a lot to do.
Yeah, I imagine it's a difficult one, isn't it, Santi? Because economies rely so heavily on income from tourism, and yet in a country like Spain, this issue of the increase in rentals and the increase in the cost of buying a house has weighed so heavily on residents. Access to housing becomes such a major driver of inequality.
No, totally, and that's the problem with tourism. Tourism generates low-income jobs with very bad wages that they really they cannot even pay. The average of the rent in Spain, in Barcelona, is 1,200 euros, and that's above the minimum wage. So a lot of people are not making enough money just to pay their rent. So you have people having to work two shifts and having a hard time to get to the end of the month. But tourism is an effect, obviously, but that's not the only effect of why there is gentrification in the city and tourism. I think that the housing problem in Spain and in Barcelona in particular also is because we don't have any public housing market. So we need to understand that if there is no public housing market, we understand in Europe that we have public education, we have public health, but we do not have public housing. And the housing has still been one of the major areas where nobody can access. No, everybody understands that the housing you can speculate, is an asset, is something you can buy and sell at the best price, and it's not a right. And that's what we are fighting also. It's a basic human rights, and that's one of our major fights that we have here.
Nick Budlender in Cape Town, let's bring you into the conversation. This is something that we relate to so much in South Africa, right? And the issues are so similar in a city like the one you're living in.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's some very, very clear similarities in terms of the effect of Airbnb and other short-term rentals on our housing market. Although, of course, in many other ways, our countries and our cities are very, very different because of, labor dynamics, income profile, et cetera, et cetera. But, what I think is undeniable and isn't just an experience in Cape Town or Barcelona, but is an experience in cities across the world, is that huge numbers of homes are being taken off the rental market and reserved for Airbnb, which really squeezes the market and squeezes people further and further out of the city. So in Cape Town, there are 18,600 entire homes that are rented for Airbnb. All of those are concentrated in the most desirable areas and areas that are already inaccessible and unaffordable to the vast majority of people. So, I think in our context of such high levels of unemployment and such weak levels of economic growth, tourism is something that has real value in South Africa. But at the same time, we need to actually properly reckon with and balance up the costs of giving up huge parts of our inner city for tourist accommodation with the sort of benefits that tourists might bring.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if you squeeze local people and local families out of the city entirely, then no one will be here all year for the city to function.
Yeah.
You know, it'll be very difficult for people to attract employees. It'll be very difficult for people to live decent lives if they constantly have to live further and further away from the city. You know, so I mean, I also agree with Santi completely that there are a range of other interventions that are more important, and the number one of those interventions is to build as much well-located affordable housing as possible. But at the same time, I think, you know, if we are building affordable housing and at the same time losing 18,000 homes to Airbnb, then it's quite difficult to kind of make up that gap. So the city of Cape Town has so far proven to be completely unwilling to attempt to kind of balance those costs and benefits or to recognize them. And yet we've seen in dozens and dozens of cities around the world really robust evidence of the effect of Airbnb, both on the prices and availability of homes, but also on the type of homes that get built. Because in Cape Town, the vast majority of new apartments that are built are sort of 15 to 30 square meters, because that's very nice for Airbnb, but that comes nowhere near to accommodating average household sizes. So it's not just that there is a negative effect right now, which anyone who's looking for an apartment in central Cape Town will tell you about, but decades and decades into the future, we're going to be left with all of these, what are basically micro apartments, and our whole city form is being shaped by a phenomenon which I just don't think is fair. You know, why should hotels and bed and breakfasts and all other forms of short-term and tourist accommodation be regulated and pay taxes and have licenses, while Airbnb, which in many ways functions as the same thing because so many owners own hundreds of apartments at once, why should they not? You know, I think we definitely need a stronger form of regulation if we're going to protect local interests.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, outside of these new apartments that are being built that are just right for Airbnb, Nick, homeowners who choose to let out their apartments or buy houses specifically with the intention of renting them on Airbnb, houses or apartments, they will argue, it's my house, I should be able to do with it as I please. But I suppose it's not that simple.
Absolutely, Michelle. I mean, it isn't that simple. I've heard that argument before, but just like we have building regulations to stop our houses from burning down, and just like we have plumbing regulations and electricity regulations and a range of other regulations to protect the public interest, we need regulations for short-term rentals, because ultimately what happens in the housing market has a really, really profound effect on every other aspect of people's lives. So to think that it's only an individual's choice what they do and there's no wider consequences for society, I just don't think that that sort of position flies, especially not in a context like South Africa, where we have this intense legacy of spatial apartheid, which really still determines where people live. So I think, you know, somebody renting out a room in their house that's empty, or someone renting their house if they go away for 2 weeks, that to me is much less of an issue than what we're seeing, which is actually that the vast majority of Airbnb apartments, 56% at least, are owned by people that have more than one listing. Some companies have 150 listings on the platform and are basically just acting as unregulated hotels.
Incredible. Santi, you know, Nick talks about whole cities being designed around phenomena like Airbnb. Are you seeing that kind of impact where you are already?
Yeah. I wanted to also point to what Nick was saying, also regarding that you cannot do whatever you want with your house, even if you are the owner, as much as you cannot drive your car at the speed you want in the middle of the street, or as well as you can. This is a first basic need. So it needs to be regulated as much as it's regulated the petrol or the energy or many others. So all those people that try to say no regulation, let the market control themselves, it's not going to work, because housing, you will pay as much, and it's not because more offer will decrease the price, because housing, you will pay as much as you need to pay, because you need to have somewhere to live. It's like a bottle of water. You will pay as much as you can pay for that bottle of water if this is the only thing you have to for drink. So this is, it doesn't apply. So in our city, yeah, we do see how neighborhoods, precisely, we were because of the pandemic, we were in a lockdown, and a lot of the center and the historical center, there was a ghost town. I mean, like many centuries ago, where was nobody on the streets at night, and it was really frightening in this sense, and to see how many neighbors had left the area, and now we were just only even in terms of for the tourists. And also Nick mentioned something about this public housing market built in well located.
Yes.
And that's also part of so we don't want cities that are designed, the center and the more touristic for the tourists, and all the rest of the people, we are living in the surroundings and having to drive or take a train for an hour to reach our working. So this is also very important. Then the cities, and Nick, I'm sure he knows much more about that, about the 15 minutes distance. No, we should be able to have our neighbors, no matter where we live, in 15 minutes walking distance, a hospital, a school, a place to do our life, so we do not need to always having to go so far. That's the logic of the Vulture funds. That we are organizing an event here in November. That's also something I wanna point out, because how do we fight this? There's something we can do. I mean, it's hard, and we have been fighting for 15 years already here in Spain. But something of the things that we have learned is this is an international fight. As we have seen, the situation in Cape Town, very similar to Barcelona, to New York, to many other countries around the world. And it's because housing is just a commodity, and that needs to change. And the only way we will change that if we internationally fight together. So we are going to have, in fact, people coming from South Africa to Barcelona in November, from New York, from Brazil. And we're going to start thinking, how can we fight together internationally? Because this needs to stop. Or it's, as you also mentioned at the beginning, it would generate so much inequality that this is going to generate a way much bigger problem than we can now really foresee.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nick, we know that story, right, of taking multiple forms of transport to get to school or to work, 2 taxis, 2 trains, and so on, not just in Cape Town, but around the country as well. And what Santi talks about, the seasonal arrival of tourists, and just how much opportunity that really does translate to. It might be more in places like Cape Town, for example, but I think the point Santi is making is that tourists leave, and then what do the residents do?
Exactly. I mean, I think that's a really important point. If you go onto Property24 or any of the real estate websites today and you try and find an apartment to rent in Cape Town, you'll notice that the majority of apartments are only available until October. So because then October arrives and all of a sudden they're taken off the market and they're rented purely as Airbnbs. And then for the rest of the year, they sort of sit vacant. And, you know, you can't expect families to rent, who have to rent, which is a huge, huge proportion of us, to move every 6 months to make space for the tourist season. You know, so of course, tourism brings some benefits, especially in a country like South Africa that has such terrible unemployment. But we aren't reckoning, and especially the city of Cape Town has made no attempt to really kind of balance those costs and the benefits. You know, and I think the point that Santi was emphasizing around location is really, really important. It's important from the perspective of justice in a country that has such a long legacy of sort of racist planning, but it's also important from a perspective of productivity. You know, Harvard released this massive study last year which looked at the barriers facing Cape Town, and it concluded that by far the biggest barrier constraining the city's productivity is the spatial dysfunction of our city, the fact that so many people live so far away from where they work. It's already like that. Now that there's Airbnb and huge central areas, all the areas with the highest concentration of jobs are becoming so utterly inaccessible to local people, that then forces the more well-off people who would have maybe afforded in those areas to look in a slightly traditionally cheaper area, forcing people on lower incomes to then go to a different area, and there's a sort of knock-on effect that runs and runs and runs. So it is a very serious issue, and it's compounding many of the issues that the city claims that they want to address around spatial integration, for instance, and the compaction of the city. So I think we seriously need to follow the lead of dozens of cities around the world and actually introduce strong regulations, because the original model of Airbnb was that you rented out a spare room in your house. The original model wasn't meant to be that you transform huge swathes of the city and you have individual people owning hundreds and hundreds of units. So I think, I genuinely think there's a serious need for intervention, and I would love to see if you could get the city on to hear them try and defend the approach of not even just not regulating, but actually entering into a partnership with Airbnb, which is moving in the exact opposite direction of global urban leaders across the world.
Santi, at the start of our discussion, you mentioned that, this is announced to be put in place in 2028. There's an election happening in your country before then, in 2027. Do you think, or are you saying that you have little faith that come 2028, there will be this ban of Airbnb? And then perhaps just a secondary question, would you be happy if there was no ban, that just some form of regulation was introduced?
No, so the first regulation that the previous city council introduced was in 2015, where they banned new apartments. So since 2015, there was a ban in new license. So Barcelona has 2,500 regulated legal apartments, touristic apartments. So, but that's in a city which there is no housing, public housing market, and we need every unit. So the regulation here is that the best is to ban completely because as Nick was mentioning, most of the houses are in the hands of people that has 1, 2, 3, several, even hundreds also. And this is not what they are trying to tell us, the mama or papa who is trying to complement. This is people that are trying to make business out of it. Okay, and Airbnb has not collaborated at all since 2015 in order to eliminate all the apartments that are in their website with no legal title to rent. So the city council said, okay, I'm banning no more licenses, and in addition, please, Airbnb, remove from your platform all the apartments and they're illegal. And Airbnb said, I'm not going to do it. This is a free platform. Everybody can upload whatever they want. And only after many pressures and fees, then Airbnb started to request that this number of your license. But sometimes you can even upload it and without that number anyway, or you can put somebody else's numbers. There are all kind of tricks that you can do. So I have a doubt, yes, because that this will really take place, because the pressure of the real estate, the pressure of Airbnb, also at the European level, it's been really, really big. The only good thing that I think is happening is that there are many now cities around Spain, and I think also in Europe with Lisbon, that are raising up, also in the Canary Islands, also in the Balearic Islands, which are with way more pressure. Nick was mentioning in October, apartments are only for tourists, but the same happened in the islands. People who wants to work, they cannot even find a house in the islands, in the Balearic Islands. They need to go and take a ferry, or take even somebody a flight and stay 3 days and at somebody's couch. And then it's completely crazy. Doctors and school teachers cannot find a place so the impact is way bigger than the one that we can see. So I'm confident it will happen, because I'm confident that we, the people, like always, will be the ones that are pressuring our politicians to do the right thing.
Let me thank both of our guests for your time this afternoon. Incredibly important discussion, and certainly one you haven't heard the last of here on 405. Nick Budlender is an urban policy researcher at Ndifuna Ukwazi, and Santi Mas De Xaxas is in Barcelona. He's a housing activist.